All right, let's just jump right into a pretty big question, one that's stirring up a ton of debate. Is Gen Z the generation with no future? We're going to unpack an argument that tackles this head on, so let's get into it.
So, the entire argument we're looking at today is built on this one idea, this cyclical view of history. It's a famous quote that suggests societies just keep repeating this pattern of hardship and prosperity, and each phase basically forges the character of the people who come next.
Which brings us to the big question, right? If we're currently living in the good times, with instant everything and endless choices, does that mean Gen Z fits the weak part of the cycle, the part that supposedly leads us back into hard times?
Okay, so to really dig into that, the source we're looking at zeroes in on three main accusations you hear a lot about Gen Z, and it's all based on recent data and surveys. Let's start with what's happening in the workplace.
And wow, get this first number, 65%. According to one survey, if a company had to do layoffs, nearly 2/3 of employers said they'd choose a Gen Z employee to let go of first. That points to a pretty massive disconnect going on.
And here's the flip side of that coin. It's not just the bosses. 1 in 8 Gen Z employees apparently quits a new job within the first week. That says a lot about loyalty and, what they expect from a job right out of the gate.
So what's behind those stats? Well, here's what employers are actually saying. They feel Gen Z can be hard to understand, sometimes lacking that old-school work ethic, wanting a lot but maybe not putting in the same level of effort and really putting their own happiness first, sometimes over their job duties.
All right, accusation number 2 is all about money. The source brings up this trend called soft saving. And basically, it's this idea of focusing on short-term goals and experiences instead of, traditional long-term savings. It's a huge shift in how a whole generation thinks about their finances.
And just look at how steep this drop is. The savings rate for young people has literally been cut by more than half compared to the historical average. The argument here is that the money's going towards things like travel, self-care, and immediate experiences, not so much into a retirement fund. And the third and final point revolves around mental health. The data here shows Gen Z reporting the highest rates of mental health struggles, more than any other generation. This has led some to label them as fragile, or to use the cycle's term, weak.
Okay. So we've laid out all the accusations, the workplace issues, the money habits, the mental health struggles. But, and this is a huge but, the source makes a really surprising claim. It says that none of this is actually Gen Z's fault. So if it's not on them, what's really going on?
This is where things get really interesting. The whole argument boils down to one single powerful idea: freedom. But it's this idea that the insane amount of freedom Gen Z has grown up with is actually a paradox, a double-edged sword.
To really get this, we gotta take a quick trip back in time. See, way back when, society was held together by a single shared belief, like religion. Then, along came modernism, and science and industry became the glue. But now, we're in a postmodern world with infinite information, infinite choices, and that's led to a ton of fragmentation.
And this analogy just hits the nail on the head. Imagine this. In the past, you had 100 people, and they were all told to go through the same door. Simple. Today, those same 100 people are bombarded with infinite information and told to find their own door. So now, everyone is just walking off in their own separate direction.
And what happens when everyone's going their own way? Well, you get some serious consequences. You get this hyper-individualism, a total lack of a unified direction. It becomes really, really hard to get people to work together on a big collective goal. And the biggest irony of all, Gen Z is often called the loneliest generation, even though they are by far the most digitally connected.
So, okay, if the real problem is this fragmentation that was just kind of baked into the world Gen Z grew up in, what do we do about it? Well, the source suggests that blaming them is pointless. The real solution is about bridging that gap between the generations.
And the big idea here is something called intergenerational learning. It's pretty straightforward, really. It's about purposely creating situations where different generations aren't just in the same room, but are actively sharing skills and values. It's about learning from each other instead of just pointing fingers.
So what exactly can they learn from each other? The argument is that the older generations, just by having lived longer, have built-in experience with stuff like resilience and persistence. But the big one, the one that's highlighted here, is patience. And think about it. Patience is super hard to learn when you live in a world that gives you everything instantly.
And this isn't just some vague, fuzzy idea. Let's talk about something concrete, like building wealth. Real investing, the kind that actually works, is a long, slow game.
It takes a ton of patience. You simply cannot rush it. And that lesson goes completely against the I want it now culture we're all swimming in.
So, what's the advice for Gen Z? Well, according to this source, it comes down to 3 things. First, you gotta detach from that constant fire hose of information. Second, try to reconnect with some of those core values from older generations. And third, start to recognize that going it alone, that hyper-individualism, isn't always the best path forward.
And that really leaves us with this final, massive question. Being free is one thing, but it doesn't have to mean being fractured, right? The freedom that Gen Z has is an incredible tool. It could lead to amazing innovation. So the challenge isn't taking away that freedom, it's figuring out how to use it to build unity instead of more isolation. How can this generation turn what looks like its biggest weakness into its greatest strength?